rule a nation. You can't just throw someone inexperienced into a high-ranking position. But what if they seem like they'll actually get what you want? If your nation's only focused on its place in the world being away from the world, then radical views can radically change your life.
The United States had always made an attempt to isolate itself. During World War I, people didn't want to have anything to do with the fighting. After the war was over, the U.S. was left with a booming economy. This led people to spend and spend, starting a method called buying on the margin. Basically, everyone was buying stocks with credit from the banks. However, nobody predicted the stock market would crash. It was one of the first dominoes for a global depression that left people in the 1930s with close to nothing.
People pulled their money out of the banks, leading to the dollar quickly losing its value and banks to run out of money. This was only made worse by the Dust Bowl, in which the ground was so polluted crops couldn't grow. Conditions were awful all around. People would line up every day to get food. Families were split up in order to make a living. The suicide rate spiked, and people even had to live in makeshift communities called Hoovervilles because they couldn't afford normal housing. Unsure of how to solve this problem, the U.S. pulled its head further into its turtle shell, hoping it could save itself on its own.
If you let me, I could. I'd show you how to build your fences, set restrictions, separate from the world. The constant battle that you hate to.
The U.S.'s response to these tough times eventually fell on the shoulders of new President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Within his first 100 days of office, he had submitted the New Deal, which set up organizations to provide people with jobs and money. While this was what the U.S. got as their example of how they could cope, it wasn't what several other countries got. Germany, for example, turned to a guy who seemed like he would give them fast results to keep from starvation and other depression hardships.
People were already dying from the problems from a global depression, and in even worse conditions than the United States. The Treaty of Versailles was killing people off with war debt in an already ravaged land. The German people needed some form of security now that they couldn't have any military. Several rulers, such as Hitler and Mussolini, began to rule. They could give protection, all they asked in return were the people's civil liberties. They promised an instant change, while FDR believed progress would be slow. FDR had qualities that would have seemed vulgar had he been a normal citizen. Hitler even claimed to be a celebrated war hero.
Hitler didn't hesitate to invade other countries. War-tired Great Britain and France gave him land, hoping that if he had enough, he would stay content to sit around. They didn't want to have to handle another world war. Ironically, this only provoked him into spreading his blitzkrieg further. Other countries only made major attempts to retaliate after he had begun to get too close. His appeasement method even helped to start another world war.
While
Nazi supporters were one group of people driven into an extreme ideology by the need to survive, there are other situations. A more similar case comes from the Japanese. While the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany stripped of weapons and dignity, Japan was in a worse situation. Trade laws left Japan isolated, and with no supplies, they turned to local dominations to get what they needed, even if it meant killing innocent civilians. The Japanese figured that they could continue to take over local land as long as there were no Pacific powers to stop them. The U.S. was viewed as the only power, resulting in a surprise aerial attack designed to cripple the U.S. naval forces in Hawaii. This is known as Pearl Harbor. While one extreme ideology comes from the Nazis, another came from revenge. People believed that the U.S. now had to stop being isolated and enter World War II in order to get back at the Japanese for what they had done. It fueled people into manufacturing back in the States, fueled people into signing up for the armed forces, and fueled more people even into fighting against the Nazis, a Japanese ally. After both Japan and Germany's individual surrenders, there were no Axis powers left. The damage had been done. Hitler's final solution had massacred millions of innocent people, and it had been carried out by the people who had been convinced from the start that he was the person they needed. The atomic bombs that the U.S. had rushed to get a hold of had both been dropped on civilian cities, developed and used by the people who thought that they were the purest. The world was once again in disrepair. However, two massive powers were still able to function, the Soviet Union and the United States. FDR's death brought along a new president, one who was not too fond of the Soviet Union's Stalin. For over the next 50 years, these two nations would fight it out in the Cold War to see who was the best.